Have you ever wondered why, in the wealthiest society in human history, you're told that your financial struggles, your mental health challenges, your inability to afford healthcare, your work-life balance problems are fundamentally your fault? Why, in a system that promises unlimited opportunity and freedom, millions of people are drowning in debt, burning out at unprecedented rates, and questioning their own worth when they can't seem to get ahead no matter how hard they try? What if I told you that this isn't coincidence, but the result of a carefully engineered psychological operation designed to protect a system that systematically concentrates wealth and power while convincing you that your suffering is evidence of your personal failures? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented economic doctrine with measurable psychological consequences that we can trace through decades of research and policy implementation. The data on this is overwhelming. According to the American Psychological Association, anxiety disorders now affect over 40 million adults, with rates of depression having increased by more than 50% since the 1980s. Simultaneously, we've witnessed the systematic implementation of economic policies that have transferred unprecedented wealth upward while wages have stagnated, social safety nets have been dismantled, and basic services have been privatized. The correlation isn't accidental. What I am about to reveal to you today are the specific psychological mechanisms that neoliberal economic theory uses to transfer responsibility for systemic failures onto individual shoulders. These aren't abstract concepts. These are precise, measurable techniques that operate in your daily life, in your workplace, in your healthcare system, in your education, and in your relationship with money, success, and self-worth. I'm going to show you exactly how Milton Friedman's economic philosophy, which promised to liberate individuals through market freedom, actually created a psychological prison where systemic problems are reframed as personal moral failings. The promise was simple and seductive. Free markets would unleash human potential. Competition would drive innovation and efficiency. Government interference would be minimized, allowing natural market forces to distribute resources optimally. Individual choice would replace bureaucratic control. Personal responsibility would replace dependence on the state. The invisible hand of the market would guide society toward prosperity for all who were willing to work for it. This was the gospel of economic freedom that reshaped our entire society over the past 4 decades. But here's what actually happened. The systematic dismantling of social support systems, the financialization of basic human needs, the transformation of citizens into consumers, and the psychological reprogramming of an entire population to believe that their individual choices and personal characteristics determine their life outcomes in systems specifically designed to concentrate wealth and power among a tiny elite. The result is a society where people blame themselves for problems that are fundamentally structural, where individuals carry psychological burdens that should be recognized as systemic failure, and where the most basic human needs have been transformed into market opportunities that extract wealth from desperation. Let me walk you through the 8 primary mechanisms through which this psychological transfer operates, because understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward reclaiming your mental freedom from a system that profits your self-blame. The first mechanism is what I call the individualization of systemic risk. Milton Friedman argued that free markets would distribute risk efficiently, with individuals making rational choices about their own economic security. What this translated to in practice was the systematic transfer of risks that were previously borne collectively by society onto individual households. Health insurance became tied to employment, making job loss a potential health catastrophe. Retirement security shifted from guaranteed pensions to individual market investment, making your golden years dependent on Wall Street performance. Education funding shifted from public investment to individual debt, making knowledge acquisition a personal financial gamble. Housing became primarily an investment vehicle rather than a human right, making stable shelter dependent on your ability to navigate complex financial markets. The psychological result of this risk transfer is profound and measurable. When you lose health insurance because you lose your job, the system tells you this is the natural consequence of your career choices. When your retirement savings evaporate in a market crash, you're told you should have diversified better or saved more. When you can't afford education, you're told you need to work harder or make smarter financial decisions. When you can't afford housing, you're told to move somewhere cheaper or increase your income. In every case, A systemic failure to provide basic security is reframed as your personal failure to make optimal individual choices. Research from the University of California, Berkeley shows that individuals living under high-risk economic conditions experience chronic stress responses identical to those found in trauma victims. Your nervous system literally cannot distinguish between being chased by a predator and facing financial insecurity in a system designed to provide no safety. But instead of recognizing this as a policy choice that creates unnecessary suffering, you're told that your anxiety and depression are personal mental health issues that you should address through individual therapy and pharmaceutical intervention. This is how the system works. It creates conditions that predictably generate psychological distress, then sells you individual solutions to collective problems while convincing you that your suffering is evidence of your personal inadequacy rather than evidence of systemic design flaws. The second mechanism operates through what I call the commodification of human development. Friedman's theory suggested that market competition would optimize the delivery of services, including education, healthcare, and social development. The practical implementation of this theory transformed human development from a collective investment in society's future into individual market transactions, where your access to growth opportunities depends entirely on your purchasing power. Think about how this operates in your daily experience. Education has been transformed from a public good designed to develop human potential into a private commodity that requires individual debt finance. Healthcare has been transformed from a basic human service into a market system, where your access to healing depends on your ability to pay premium prices for basic care. Even personal development, mental health support, and community connection have been largely privatized into individual market purchase rather than collective social investment. The psychological impact of this commodification is that you begin to internalize market logic as the measure of your human worth. If you can't afford quality education, the system suggests this reflects your insufficient economic value rather than a policy choice to exclude people from knowledge based on wealth. If you can't afford healthcare, you're encouraged to see this as a personal financial failure rather than a systemic choice to deny basic care to people who can't pay premium prices. If you struggle with mental health and can't afford quality therapy, you're told to try self-help rather than recognizing that healing requires community support that has been systematically dismantled and privatized. Studies from the American Journal of Community Psychology demonstrate that society with stronger collective investment in human development shows significantly lower rates of individual distress, even when controlling for overall wealth level. The research is clear. When basic human needs are treated as collective responsibilities rather than individual market transactions, people experience less anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. But this research is systematically ignored in favor of maintaining a system that profits from your desperation to purchase individually what should be provided collectively. The third mechanism I want you to understand is the naturalization of inequality. This is perhaps the most insidious psychological operation embedded in Friedman's economic philosophy. The theory claimed that free markets would reward merit and effort, naturally sorting people into economic positions that reflect their individual contributions and capabilities. What this actually accomplished, the creation of a pseudo-scientific justification for extreme inequality that frames vast differences in life outcomes as natural rather than systematically produced. Here's how this operates in your psychological reality. When you observe that some people have access to opportunities, resources, and security that you don't have, the system immediately provides you with explanations that center on individual characteristics rather than structural advantages. Wealthy people are described as more disciplined, more intelligent, more hardworking, or more skilled at making good choices. Poor people are described as lacking motivation, making bad decisions, having poor work ethics, or failing to develop marketable skills. Middle-class people who are struggling are told they need to upgrade their skills, work harder, or make better financial choices. This naturalization of inequality serves a specific psychological function. It prevents you from questioning the systemic mechanisms that create and maintain vast differences in life outcomes. Instead of asking why some people are born into families with wealth, connections, and opportunities while others are born into families struggling with basic survival, you're encouraged to focus on individual characteristics and choices. Instead of questioning why wages have stagnated while productivity has increased dramatically, you're told to focus on developing skills that will make you more valuable in the marketplace. The psychological research on this is devastating. Studies from Harvard School of Public Health show that people living in highly unequal societies experience measurably higher levels of chronic stress, anxiety, and depression, even when controlling for individual income levels. The stress of living in unequal systems literally damages your physical and mental health, but the system trains you to interpret these health impacts as personal problems rather than predictable responses to unjust social organization. What's particularly cruel about this mechanism is that it weaponizes your own empathy and moral reasoning against you. Because you believe in fairness and justice, when you observe inequality, you assume there must be fair reasons for it. The system exploits this assumption by providing explanations that center on individual merit rather than structural advantage, training you to blame yourself when you struggle and to credit individual virtue when others. The fourth mechanism operates through what I call the privatization of social problems. Friedman argued that government programs created dependency and that private charity and individual responsibility would more effectively address social challenges. The practical result was the systematic defunding of public programs designed to address collective problems, forcing individuals to seek private market solutions that are fundamentally social. Consider how this plays out in your actual life experience. When you struggle with mental health, instead of having access to robust community mental health programs, you're directed toward individual therapy that you must purchase privately. When you face housing insecurity, instead of having access to social housing programs, you're told to improve your credit score and save for a down payment. When you experience workplace exploitation, instead of having strong labor protection, you're advised to develop better negotiation skills or find a different job. When you struggle with debt, instead of having access to public financial services, you're directed toward private financial planning services that often charge fees you can't afford. This privatization of social problems creates a double psychological burden. First, you're dealing with the actual stress of the problem itself. Second, you're dealing with the additional stress of being responsible for finding and funding your own solution to problems that are systematically produced by the economic structure itself. The result is that you experience both the material consequences of systemic failures and the psychological burden of believing you're responsible for solving them individually. Research from the Journal of Health and Social Behavior shows that people living in society with strong public support systems report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of chronic stress, and better overall mental health outcomes. But this research is systematically suppressed in favor of narratives that glorify individual responsibility and private market solution, even when those solutions consistently fail to address problems at the scale they actually exist. The psychological function of this method is to prevent collective action by convincing individuals that social problems are really just collections of individual problems that require individual solutions. Instead of organizing collectively to demand systemic changes, people exhaust themselves trying to solve individually what can only be solved collectively, and blame themselves when their individual efforts inevitably fail to address systemic issues. The fifth mechanism I need you to understand is what I call the therapeutic reframing of political problems. This is one of the most sophisticated psychological operations embedded in neoliberal doctrine. When Friedman's economic policies predictably generated widespread psychological distress, instead of questioning the policies themselves, the system developed an entire industry designed to help individuals psychologically adapt to conditions that are fundamentally harmful to human well-being. Here's how this operates in your daily experience. When you feel anxious about financial insecurity, instead of questioning why financial insecurity is systematically maintained in the wealthiest society in history, you're directed toward anxiety management techniques. When you feel depressed about meaningless work in exploitative conditions, instead of questioning why work is organized in ways that systematically drain human spirit, you're directed toward antidepressant medication and individual therapy focused on adjusting your attitude toward conditions that are objectively depressing. When you feel overwhelmed by the competing demands of survival in a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum security, instead of questioning why basic survival requires such exhausting effort in a society with abundant resources, you're directed towards stress management and work-life balance techniques that focus on your individual capacity to cope rather than the systemic conditions that create unnecessary stress. This therapeutic reframing serves a specific political function. It channels your natural psychological responses to unjust conditions into individual healing projects rather than collective organizing systemic change. Your depression becomes a medical condition rather than a rational response to depressing conditions. Your anxiety becomes a mental health disorder rather than a reasonable reaction to systematic insecurity. Your anger becomes an emotion management challenge rather than appropriate outrage at exploitative systems. The research on this is clear and damning. Studies from the British Journal of Sociology show that societies experiencing rapid neoliberal policy implementation show corresponding increases in individual psychological distress and corresponding growth in therapeutic industries designed to help people adapt to harmful conditions rather than change those conditions. The correlation is so consistent it can be predicted with mathematical precision. What's particularly insidious about this mechanism is that it co-opts the language and techniques of genuine healing to serve the function of political pacification. Real therapy and authentic mental health support are valuable and necessary. But when therapeutic frameworks are used to convince people to individually adjust to collectively harmful conditions, rather than working together to change those conditions, therapy becomes a tool of political control rather than human liberation. The sixth mechanism operates through what I call the gamification of survival. Friedman's economic theory promised that market competition would create exciting opportunities for advancement and achievement. What this translated to in practice was the transformation of basic survival activity competitive games, where your access to security, dignity, and resources depends on your ability to successfully compete against other people who need the same things you need. Think about how this shows up in your everyday reality. Job searching has been gamified into a complex performance where you must market yourself as a brand, optimize your resume for algorithmic screening, and compete against hundreds of other candidates for positions that often don't provide living wages. Healthcare has been gamified into a complex navigation challenge where you must research providers, compare insurance plans, understand billing codes, and advocate for your own care within systems designed to minimize costs rather than maximize healing. Housing has been gamified into a competitive bidding process where you must present yourself as the most attractive candidate to landlords or compete against investors for the opportunity to shelter at prices that often require decades of debt finance. Even education has been gamified into a competitive achievement system where students compete for limited spots in programs that require significant debt financing with no guarantee of employment that will justify the financial investment. The psychological impact of this gamification is profound and measurable. When basic survival requires constant competitive performance, your nervous system exists in a state of chronic activation that is identical to combat stress. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that people living in highly competitive economic systems show stress hormone patterns that are indistinguishable from those found in soldiers in active combat zones. But here's the crucial psychological manipulation. The system frames this chronic stress as exciting opportunity, rather than systematically imposed suffering. You're told that competition brings out your best qualities, that market pressure motivates innovation and excellence, and that the stress you experience is the natural price of freedom and opportunity. Your exhaustion is reframed as the cost of success. Your anxiety is reframed as the excitement of possibility. Your depression is reframed as the temporary consequence of not yet achieving your goals. This gamification serves a specific function in maintaining systemic inequality. It prevents solidarity between people who share common interests by forcing them to compete against each other for access to resources that could easily be shared. Instead of working together to demand that basic needs be met collectively, people exhaust themselves competing individually for the opportunity to meet their needs through market success. The seventh mechanism I want you to understand is what I call the responsibilization of systemic outcomes. This is perhaps the most direct transfer of accountability from systems to individuals. Friedman's theory claimed that free markets would create optimal outcomes through the aggregation of individual choices, which meant that any problems with outcomes must be the result of poor individual choices rather than systemic design flaws. Here's how this operates in your psychological reality. When wages fail to keep pace with the cost of living, instead of questioning wage policies or cost structures, you're told that you need to develop more valuable skills or work harder to justify higher compensation. When healthcare costs consume increasingly large portions of household budget, instead of questioning healthcare pricing structure, you're told to make better health choices to avoid medical expenses or shop more carefully for medical services. When housing costs make homeownership impossible for entire generations, instead of questioning housing policy or development pattern, young people are told they need to make different lifestyle choices, move to cheaper areas, or delay major life decisions until they can afford market-rate housing. When student debt prevents people from making major life choices like starting families or purchasing homes, instead of questioning education financing system, people are told they made poor educational investment decisions and need to prioritize debt repayment over life goals. This responsibilization creates a specific psychological burden that researchers call systemic gaslight. You observe problems that are clearly beyond individual control, but the dominant explanation system convinces you these problems are actually the result of your individual choices and characteristics. Your rational perception of systemic dysfunction is systematically undermined by explanations that center individual responsibility for collective outcome. Studies from the Journal of Social show that people living under conditions of systemic responsibilization show measurably higher rates of self-blame, learned helpless, and what psychologists call depressive realism, the accurate perception that individual efforts have minimal impact on outcomes that are systemically determined. But instead of validating this accurate perception, the mental health system typically treats depressive realism as a cognitive distortion that needs to be corrected through individual therapy focused on restoring belief in individual agency. The psychological function is to prevent systemic analysis by training people to constantly examine their own choices and characteristics and encounter problems that are structured. Instead of developing collective understanding of shared challenge, people become trapped in cycles of self-examination and self-improvement that exhaust their mental energy while leaving systemic problems completely unaddressed. The eighth and final mechanism I want you to understand is what I call the entrepreneuriation of identity. Friedman's theory suggested that everyone could potentially become a successful entrepreneur in a sufficiently free market, which translated in practice to the psychological requirement that individuals constantly market themselves, optimize their personal brand, and take individual responsibility for their market value in systems designed to concentrate wealth and power among people who already possess capital. Think about how this shows up in your daily psychological experience. You're constantly encouraged to think of yourself as a personal brand that needs to be optimized for market appeal. Your social media presence becomes a marketing platform for your personal value. Your education becomes an investment in your future earning potential. Your relationships become networking opportunities. Your hobbies become potential side businesses. Your personality traits become assets to be leveraged for competitive advantage. This entrepreneuriation of identity creates a psychological condition where your sense of self-worth becomes directly tied to your market performance. When you struggle financially, you experience this as evidence that you failed to effectively market yourself. When you can't find work that pays living wages, you interpret this as evidence that you failed to develop sufficient market value. When you feel unfulfilled by work that treats you as a disposable resource, you're told that you need to take more entrepreneurial responsibility for creating meaningful work for yourself. The research on this psychological condition is deeply disturbing. Studies from the European Journal of Social Psychology show that people living under conditions of intensive identity entrepreneuriation show significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and what psychologists call burnout syndrome, the complete exhaustion of mental and physical resources to chronic overperformance in systems that provide minimal security or recognition. But the most insidious aspect of this mechanism is that it usurps your natural creativity and self-determination in service of a system that systematically undermines both. Your genuine desire to express your unique gifts and contribute meaningfully to the world gets channeled into marketing performance designed to make you more appealing to systems that profit from your labor while providing minimal compensation or security return. The psychological function is to prevent people from imagining alternatives to market-based identity by convincing them that their individual success within existing systems is the highest form of self-actualization. Instead of working collectively to create systems that support human flourishing, people exhaust themselves trying to optimize their individual performance within systems designed to extract value from their effort while providing minimal returns. Now, let me show you how these 8 mechanisms work together to create what researchers call neoliberal subjectivity, a psychological condition where you automatically blame yourself for problems that are systemically produced. Constantly work to optimize your individual performance in systems designed to exploit your labor, and exhaust your mental and physical resources trying to solve individually what can only be solved collectively. The first pattern you need to recognize is how these mechanisms create what psychologists call learned helplessness with hyperinsensibility. You accurately perceive that your individual efforts have minimal impact on outcomes that are systemically determined. But instead of recognizing this as evidence of systemic dysfunction, you interpret it as evidence that you need to try harder, work smarter, or take more personal responsibility for changing outcomes that are fundamentally beyond individual control. The second pattern is how these mechanisms create competitive isolation. Even though you share common interests and challenges with millions of other people, the system trains you to compete against those people rather than work with. preventing the collective action that would be necessary to address systemic problems effectively. The third pattern is how these mechanisms create therapeutic pacification. Your natural emotional responses to unjust conditions get channeled into individual healing projects rather than collective organizing for systemic change, exhausting your political energy while leaving oppressive systems completely intact. The fourth pattern is how these mechanisms create entrepreneurial exhaustion. You constantly work to optimize your individual performance, market your personal brand, and take responsibility for your economic outcomes in systems specifically designed to concentrate wealth among people who already possess capital, leaving you chronically stressed and financially insecure despite maximum individual effort. The fifth pattern is how these mechanisms create systemic gaslighting. You observe dysfunction and injustice clearly, but the dominant explanation systems convince you that these observations reflect your personal failures rather than accurate perceptions of systemic problems, undermining your trust in your own rational analysis of social. Here's what you need to understand about the cumulative psychological impact of these mechanisms. They don't just create individual mental health problems. They create a population-level psychological condition that prevents effective resistance to systemic exploitation. When people blame themselves for systemic problems, exhaust themselves competing against each other for resources that could be shared, channel their political energy into individual therapy, and constantly work to optimize their performance in exploitative systems, they become psychologically incapable of the collective action that would be necessary to create systemic change. This isn't accidental. This is the intended psychological outcome of economic policies designed to concentrate wealth and power while preventing effective resistance from the people being exploited. The system doesn't just extract economic value from your labor. It extracts psychological energy from your natural responses to injustice, channeling that energy into individual projects that serve systemic interests rather than your own. But here's what the system doesn't want you to understand. These psychological conditions are not permanent features of human nature. They are learned responses to specific social conditions, which means they can be unlearned when those conditions change. The research on this is absolutely clear. When people live in systems that provide security, dignity, and genuine opportunity for meaningful contribution, the psychological conditions I've described simply don't develop. Studies from Scandinavian countries with strong social safety nets, collective investment in human development, and democratic control over economic policy show dramatically lower rates of anxiety, depression, chronic stress, and systemic self-blame. People living in systems that prioritize collective well-being over individual competition report higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger social connections, and greater sense of personal agency. The psychological health outcomes are so consistently different that they can be predicted based on policy structures alone. This means that your psychological suffering under current conditions is not evidence of your personal inadequacy. It's evidence that you are a healthy human being responding normally to conditions that are fundamentally hostile to human well-being. Your anxiety about financial insecurity is rational. Your depression about meaningless work is appropriate. Your anger about systemic injustice is justified. Your exhaustion from constant competitive performance is completely understandable. The problem isn't with your psychological responses. The problem is with the conditions that predictably generate these responses in healthy human beings. And because these conditions are the result of specific policy choices rather than natural laws, they can be changed through collective action organized around different values and priorities. Here's what I want you to do with this understanding. First, stop blaming yourself for problems that are systemically produced. When you struggle financially, remember that wage stagnation and cost inflation are policy choices, not evidence of your personal failures. When you feel anxious about security, remember that systematic insecurity is politically maintained, not naturally occurring. When you feel depressed about meaningless work, remember that work could be organized to develop human potential rather than extract maximum profit from human effort. Second, start connecting your individual experiences to systemic patterns. When you observe inequality, recognize it as the predictable outcome of policies designed to concentrate wealth rather than natural differences in individual merit. When you experience competitive stress, recognize it as the imposed requirement of systems that could easily provide security for everyone, rather than natural scarcity that requires competition. Third, channel your emotional responses to unjust conditions into collective action, rather than individual therapy designed to help you adapt to harmful conditions. Your anger is political energy that could be used to organize for systemic change. Your anxiety is information about conditions that need to be changed collectively. Your depression is a rational response to depressing conditions that could be transformed through organized resistance. Fourth, resist the entrepreneurization of your identity by remembering that your worth as a human being is not determined by your market performance. You have value that exists independent of your economic productivity. Your relationships have meaning that transcends networking opportunities. Your creativity has purpose that extends beyond personal branding. Your life has significance that cannot be measured by market metrics. And finally, recognize that the individualistic explanations for systemic problems serve the interests of people who profit from the current system, rather than your interests as someone who suffers under it. Every time you blame yourself for systemic failure, you protect the people responsible for creating and maintaining those failures. Every time you compete against other victims of the same system instead of working together for systemic change, you serve the interests of people who benefit from your division and exhaustion. The psychological liberation I'm offering you today is this understanding. Your suffering is not evidence of your personal inadequacy. It's evidence of your humanity responding appropriately to inhumane conditions. Your struggles are not proof of your individual failures. They're proof that you are a healthy person trying to survive in systems designed to prioritize profit over human well-being. Your emotional responses to injustice are not mental health problems that need individual treatment. They're rational responses to unjust conditions that need collective transformation. The system wants you to believe that your problems are personal so that you'll exhaust yourself trying to solve individually what can only be solved collectively. But now you understand the specific mechanisms through which this psychological manipulation operates, which means you can resist it consciously and organize with other people who share your interest in creating systems that serve human needs, rather than concentrate wealth among people who already have more than they could possibly use. Your mental freedom begins with recognizing that the problems you face are not yours alone, that the solutions require collective action, and that your psychological responses to systematic injustice are evidence of your wisdom rather than proof of your weakness. The system created these problems. The system maintains these problems. And working collective, we can transform these systems into arrangements that support human flourishing rather than extract wealth from human suffering. This is not about returning to some imaginary past or implementing some utopian vision. This is about recognizing that current conditions are policy choices rather than natural laws, and that different policy choices would predictably generate different psychological outcomes for millions of people currently suffering under arrangements designed to serve the interests of a small elite at the expense of everyone else. Your psychological liberation is political liberation. Your mental health is collective action. Your personal healing is systemic transformation. And understanding the mechanisms I've shown you today is the first step toward reclaiming your mind from systems designed to profit from your confusion, exhaustion, and self-blame. The question isn't whether you deserve better conditions. You obviously do. The question is whether you're willing to work with other people to create those conditions, starting with the recognition that your individual suffering is connected to systemic arrangements that can be changed through organized collective action based on different values and the ones currently organizing our society. This is your invitation to stop blaming yourself for problems you didn't create and start working with others to solve problems that we can only address together. Your mind is not the problem. The system is the problem. And recognizing this difference is the beginning of both personal healing and political transformation that could benefit millions of people currently trapped in the same psychological prison that was built around you. The choice is yours, but you no longer have to make it alone or without understanding the forces you're choosing to resist. Your clarity is your power. Your connection to others who share your situation is your strength, and your refusal to blame yourself for systemic failures is your first act of resistance against arrangements designed to break your spirit in service of other people's profit. Welcome to your psychological liberation. Welcome to your political awakening. Welcome to the understanding that could change everything, starting with how you think about yourself and extending to how we organize society for the well-being of everyone, rather than the wealth accumulation of a few. The mechanisms I've revealed operate automatically until you understand them consciously. Now that you understand them, you can choose to resist them. And that resistance is the beginning of freedom that extends far beyond your individual mind, to encompass the collective transformation of conditions that currently generate unnecessary suffering for millions of people who deserve so much better than what this system provides. Your suffering was never your fault. Your liberation starts with recognizing that truth and acting on it collectively with others who share your understanding and your commitment to creating something better for all of us.